Yeah, so thank you all for having me. It's kind of a surreal moment. I get to give the BBL as an assistant professor because I was in your shoes at one point at University of Maryland. So this is really, really sweet to be back here. So thank you all for this opportunity. Today, I'm going to describe some of my work on AI to support everyday life for people with dementia. So I will be covering a lot of studies in very little detail, if that makes sense. Like I'm not going to dive deeply into one study, but I think it's more interesting to get a little flavor of all the different things that I've been able to learn over a bunch of different studies that I've done. So today, let's start with just a definition of what is dementia. So not everyone I realize in this room knows what dementia is. So I'm going to describe a little bit about dementia, what that means, and the kinds of people that I work with. Right. So dementia is really just a term, an umbrella term for neurodegenerative conditions that involve changes in functional abilities. So if you've heard of dementia, you've probably heard of Alzheimer's disease, but that's just one type of dementia. There's actually a whole bunch, and even this slide doesn't cover all the different kinds of dementia. But each of these different conditions affect your brain differently. So it could be cognitive changes, which you're probably aware of with memory changes, right? I feel like that's talked about a lot in the media. But it's all sorts of things. It could be changes in judgment, changes in sensory abilities, changes in motor and dexterity and proprioception and all kinds of things. So that's something that's going to be important as you hear about my work moving forward, just understanding and kind of putting your head in that space that dementia is not just about cognitive things, but there are all sorts of acquired differences that people experience. Also, dementia is progressive. And unfortunately, there is no known medical intervention or lifestyle change that's going to stop this progression. Although we're hopeful for the latest drug. I can't remember what it's called. It's not promising, right? There's been drugs in the past that have claimed they're going to cure Alzheimer's and they don't. So, being that we don't necessarily have a cure at the moment, it's very important to understand that people will progress. When you're diagnosed with dementia, it's typically relatively unnoticeable. And if you were talking to someone who is diagnosed in the very early stages, you might not even know you're talking to someone that's diagnosed with dementia, right? Because it's small, subtle changes they're experiencing. So in my work, I'm actually working with people primarily in those mild to moderate stages of dementia. So that means that maybe they have difficulty coming up with the right word in a conversation, or completing multi-step tasks, or planning out an entire day. These kinds of smaller changes where maybe they used to be able to do those things, but now they have greater difficulty completing the same tasks. In the more moderate stages of dementia, people experience deeper confusion. They can become lost or forgetful of events or personal histories. And typically these people need a little bit more help, whether that's from assistive technology or other people, but just assistance in daily life. But it's very important that you understand that in both of these stages of the progression, people are generally able to just continue on participating in daily life with accommodations. So I wanted to help put perspective on who are we talking about, how many people, right? How many people are we talking about here? Currently, there are about 55 million people living with dementia, and roughly 10 million new cases each year. So we're talking about a large population of people, right? This is not a handful of people. This is actually many, many people affected, because 55 million is only those who are estimated to be diagnosed. But if you have a family member or, I don't know, a friend, a loved one who has dementia, you're also affected by that diagnosis. So it actually affects a lot of people. Let's get into the AI part of this. So currently, with so many people being diagnosed with dementia and advances in computer vision and image recognition and analyzing images, that kind of thing, AI has been used heavily to diagnose, to be able to detect when brain changes are occurring and what sorts of brain changes are occurring and what portions of your brain, that kind of thing. And this is really important because it helps us with advances in machine learning. It's helping us understand and diagnose people earlier. So this is actually a really important topic for research. But AI has also been used to support people in more severe stages by tracking and monitoring just like their daily lives. So if they're constrained to being in their home, AI systems and sensors have been used to monitor the kinds of things that they're doing. So with dementia, there's often your sense of balance changes. So there is a higher risk of like falling and hurting yourself, right? So AI systems have been designed to support caregivers and healthcare practitioners to just visually monitor people in their homes. Detect if they've fallen, like this example, if they're waving their hands, waving for help, that kind of thing. But this example I thought was better than most because it's not literally a video recording of someone in their home. It's abstracting and not showing like the actual person's face or if they're doing something that they wouldn't want shown to their caregiver or children or whatever. Okay, so although detecting and diagnosing and in-home safety are very, very, very important things, I do not want to belittle those contributions, but I am more interested in thinking of and ideating ways of how we can use AI in that in-between time, right? When someone is maybe newly diagnosed or in the early stages of dementia, and how can we support them just in their daily lives as they experience difficulty with executive functioning and completing multiple steps of a task and just everyday things. How can we leverage these tools that are smart to augment and support people to become the person they want to be? So there's open opportunities for the design of human-centered technologies in this space. Technologies here that are focusing on empowering people living with mild to moderate dementia through high levels of human control and automation, right? These kinds of technologies can help basically support people to, like I said, be the person they want to be, where the previous AI technologies and the majority of work in this space to date has focused on monitoring and not giving agency back to people, but more so supporting clinicians or caregivers. So my work is really trying to figure out what challenges people with dementia are experiencing and what kinds of interventions and assistive technologies they want. So today, I'll get more into my work now that you have that background. Today, I'm going to first describe pretty briefly ways tech-savvy people with dementia have configured AI systems in their everyday lives. And then I'm going to highlight some promising future directions for AI based on a bunch of different studies. So first, we'll talk about just current uses and how people have configured their smart homes. And in this work, we begin to answer this research question, right? In what ways do tech-savvy people with mild to moderate dementia use AI in their daily life? This is a big question that needs much more further work. So today, I'm just going to give kind of an example that emerged from those interviews. But if you want to read more, please check out our paper from 2021. Okay, let's get into it. So one participant's daily routine with technology is basically, we'll go through Arthur's routine. He starts the night before, okay, where he's programmed his Alexa voice assistant to remind him to refill his teapot. The teapot is connected to a smart plug, which heats up each morning at a pre-specified time, at which point he's programmed his Alexa to say, Arthur, your tea is ready, right? Wake up. It's time to get up for the day. He'll then take his tea and he will go sit in his big comfy chair and he'll get his flash briefing from Alexa. And he has pre-specified which news sources he wants to hear from. Okay, so following his news briefing, Arthur does what's called a mindfulness exercise. So he says this helps him to get rid of the cobwebs. Mindfulness exercises are something that's very common for people with dementia to do every day. There isn't a ton of research that says that it's valid or actually helps improve cognition, but it qualitatively helps people feel better and feel like they're getting rid of cobwebs. So that's what he does. Also, Arthur has a background in programming. So he's included reminders each day that use non-standard phrases. So, for example, one example he provided was his Alexa will say, Arthur, you need to have a shower or you will smell, right? He felt like that was a better, more helpful way for his Alexa to help him with his routine than just saying it's time to shower or something like that. So anyways, once Arthur's ready to leave his house, basically he takes his tablet, which he's enabled with Alexa with him, so that he has this single portable system, right? So for example, when he's waiting for a bus, right? If he's in like a big bus station, there's a bunch of different buses, based on different apps and whatnot, it will tell you your bus is going to arrive in 20 minutes. So for Arthur, he says that this system that he's taken a lot of time and effort designing keeps him in a routine that has established to basically help him work within the context of his daily life and social relationships. And this is just one example of the daily routines that participants from our study described, right? So they were all personalizing and using different levels of technologies, right? Like some people didn't want to use Alexa, but they were using lots of different apps on their smartphone, things like that. So every person that we talked to had their own routine management system that incorporated AI in some way. I think that's all I wanted to say about that one. So now that you have a really quick, like whirlwind view of how commercially available systems are used by a few select tech-savvy people with mild to moderate dementia, I want to talk about some future promising directions that I see based on our past work. So in these studies, and there's a bunch included at the bottom of this slide, so again, hitting these at a very high level, we cover some challenges that people with dementia experience when using technology. And then with each of these challenges, what I want to discuss is how AI systems could be used to address some of these things. And then I'll also hit on briefly at a high level some ongoing work being conducted in my lab. Past research has identified many different barriers that people living with mild to moderate dementia can experience with technology. These identified in past work are things like the cost of devices, ethical issues with monitoring systems, people's attitudes towards technology, and then a few challenges with the way technology is designed. But most of this past work focuses on cognitive changes people experience due to, overwhelming information systems or just issues with memory, like literally not being able to remember how to use a system. But there's a lot of other changes that people experience with dementia that affect the way they interact with technology. And I've talked through some of those changes at the beginning of the presentation, but in the next few slides, I'm going to go through some of the sensory and cognitive changes people experience and how those affect tech use, but also how AI can assist. So first thing, fluctuations in sensory ability can affect reading. So participants described literally where at like 8 a.m. they could read a font size of 14. By 4 p.m., they can read a font size of 24 as the smallest font, right? So if they were to be reading on a piece of paper, right, they're not able to change the font size. So then they just aren't able to read after a certain point in the day because of these really complex changes in visual ability that they're experiencing. And this was really interesting because the fluctuations in ability aren't always experienced every day, right? So maybe one day they could experience these changes in visual ability, and the next day they're okay to read font size 14 the whole day. So it's really a complex problem here of how visual changes interplay with cognitive changes and affect technology use. Another challenge that we found is people with dementia had a hard time deciphering information. And this made sense, right? All of us probably have difficulty with really long passages. So word count was a problem. Anytime there's lots of jargon in information, but they also experienced changes in reading comprehension, which we thought was super interesting. So where some people that we interviewed used to be PhDs or had their masters, right? Like they could read really complex sentence structures and whatnot. Now their ability to read and comprehend information has changed. But then we also found this really interesting, like sensory visual change that affected cognitive ability, where certain fonts messed with people's brains and made them like motion sick to read them. So lots of issues right here around the way sensory and cognitive abilities change and affect reading. One participant, Arnold, not the same, I don't know why I used the same name, I must really like that name, pseudonym. It's not, he says, it's not that I'm not interested, I'll find something, but then I'll have trouble understanding what they're actually saying. And then he says he'll go back 5 or 6 times and he might get to the meaning of one of those more complex words. So it's, again, this is something that people want to be reading, right? They want to be taking in new information and continuing to learn, but the way that our user interfaces are currently structured are just not accessible to them. So another challenge people had was with just traditional keyboards. So people can experience really complex dexterity changes like in their fingers when they have dementia. So this can be problematic if you're trying to type on a keyboard. So things like participants in our study were using like Alexa to record journals instead of physically writing on paper or typing out a journal entry. Others, practitioners that we interviewed, suggested using pretty traditional assistive devices, like things like Dragon Speak to talk to and dictate to, and when traditional keyboards became really difficult. Other participants talked about the changes in verbal interactions with technology use, where they were saying, like, when technology gives, for example, like a notification sound or like a Teams message ding, right? That doesn't register anymore. So they'll hear the sound and know that's supposed to indicate something, but they can't make the connection because it's not verbally saying what that notification represents. So one participant actually went into, he used, I think it's called Zedge, I don't know, this app that helped him. So every single notification he gets on his phone now says what that notification is. So for example, when he gets a WhatsApp notification, it literally, his phone speaks to him and says WhatsApp. Okay, couple more challenges and then we'll get into opportunities. Another, in a study we did where we were looking at mobile phone use, smartphone use specifically, we found that participants had a really hard time navigating through their phone. So it wasn't that, it was more about maneuvering through the vast amount of applications and options within the phone. So Thomas describes this as maneuvering through the phone as it, meaning the phone becomes more useful with all these different apps and features. I think it can become more challenging because there's more stuff squeezed in there, and finding it all and maneuvering through it all can be a real challenge. And then another challenge, and then I promise I will get to the opportunities, was this idea of time pressure and like really high stress and fatigue that impairs task execution. So for example, Eleonora described a time when she was, what she says is cognitively exhausted and waiting for a specific bus to come get her. The bus was delayed for 3 hours. And she just sat waiting at the bus stop into the night. And she was in a big city, so this was problematic. But although Eleonora was able to check on her phone to see the bus is still delayed. She didn't have the wherewithal to figure out, okay, what do I do now? Like the bus is delayed, but she didn't have the ability to search through her phone, right, and find the Uber app and then Uber home instead of waiting for the bus. And she attributed that to this almost time pressure of the bus is going to be here, the bus is going to be here. I have to wait on the bus. But also it was a stressful situation, which impaired her ability to execute a task that she normally could execute. So some opportunities as described by participants. So with these challenges, participants, especially with the sensory things that they were going through, wanted customizable user interfaces to address issues with navigating, issues with changes and fluctuations throughout the day. They wanted partially, they wanted systems that made just icons more recognizable, but also adaptive in the sense of, or customizable in the sense of less options when they have fluctuations in ability where so many options are overwhelming. Another opportunity participants described is the idea of more proactive technological assistance. So in the instance, so go back a couple slides, of the bus stop, right? If her phone was able to say, or in this case, her phone, because that was her AI system she carried with her, if her phone was able to say, this bus is delayed by, 3 hours in this case, here are 2 other options for you to get home, right? If she was able to just speak to her phone and say, I'm confused, help me get home, and it gave her a few other options, that would be immensely helpful. So they talked through this idea of more proactiveness from the device itself, from the technologies that they were using. So Preston's example, he talked through specifically when he had issues using his phone, he wanted his phone to say, okay, this task is taking you longer than normal to complete. What about trying the stylus? Maybe you're having issues with, he's not selecting because of dexterity changes, being able to select the app that he wants. So having his phone actually propose, here's this new system, try this. Or it looks like you're not using the system as intended. Do you need a tutorial, right? And walking through how to use a different interface. Participants really wanted these kinds of like proactive assistance. So anyway, thought that was really cool. But I wanted to highlight a few. You're probably wondering, in what use cases is AI applicable to people with dementia? So I gave you a couple, but I wanted to highlight some of the specific use cases and opportunities that I have seen and that my lab is currently investigating. So health information seeking is one that all these past challenges that we've talked through, one area that's really important for people with dementia because of the changes in ability to read. And also, a little more background on dementia, when someone's diagnosed, they often aren't provided with resources to like manage their condition, right? Because dementia can last many, many years, right? So often when someone's diagnosed, they're literally given their diagnosis and told to go plan the rest of their lives, like end of life planning, and that's it. No therapies, no support groups, no nothing. So people go online in search of information to help fill this disequilibrium that they're experiencing because of the diagnosis. But if they can't read the information that's available online, it's not useful for them, right? So in our work, basically we're trying to figure out ways. We have some preliminary data that talks through the emotional inaccessibility, and I've talked through some of the cognitive inaccessibilities of this online information. So what we're trying to do is basically quantify the level of cognitive load, right? So the level of cognitive load and emotional responses of people living with dementia compared to healthy older adults when looking at different types of digital health dementia specific information. So in this study, we're showing people basically a medical article, an advocacy article, a blog post, and a pseudoscience article. We're also interested in trust, but that felt a little outside of this talk, so I didn't include it here. But we're doing this whole study with using eye tracking and effective computing to see if we can quantify all of this qualitative research that we have describing this challenge. We want to see if we can quantify it, right? And if we're able to see which articles are causing, or which types of information presentation are causing the most cognitive load and emotional inaccessibility, then we can help design systems that maybe tailor. Maybe they want to see medical articles, but those aren't accessible. So how do we tailor the information to lower cognitive load while still providing trustworthy information? So really here, the opportunity for AI that we see and that we're trying to really tease out if the opportunity is there is for determining settings changes necessary to make digital health information more accessible, right? So how can we use things like eye tracking and effective computing on maybe phones or desktops to help know when a text resource needs to be adjusted for someone's fluctuating cognitive abilities or sensory abilities. So maybe this is detecting when someone's squinting their eyes because there's really small text, or truly detecting like using pupil dilation to see how much cognitive load, or maybe cognitive load doesn't matter. We should be focusing on emotional impacts of the information that we're giving people. So that's what that study is looking at. Another study that we're working on, and another use case, is when you think about people with MCI and dementia in the workforce. So as I talked about in the beginning of this talk, we have all these advancements in being able to diagnose people earlier in the condition. So if we're able to identify people earlier, so then they may be still in the workforce. They could still be just doing their daily life. And again, those cognitive changes aren't as apparent, so they could still be contributing in the workforce. So approximately today, 9% of people living with dementia worldwide, so that's like about 5 million people, are diagnosed under the age of 65. So likely these people are still working. This is I believe, a significant number of people, because a lot of people who are in that early stage also don't get a diagnosis. So these are just the people that we know of that have a diagnosis. There's probably many, many more that we don't know that are in that subjective cognitive decline kind of phase. Anyways, so in our ongoing work, we're actually interviewing people with MCI and dementia who are still currently working, to understand what kind of challenges they're experiencing at work, what assistive technologies they're using, if any, and then ideating and trying to match current assistive technologies with their changes in ability, right? So technologies designed for people who are deaf or blind, or all of these new AI systems that are coming out. So other examples of these kinds of toolkit things that we're going to try: AI text-based summarization, also ChatGPT. We just did a really fun focus group with about 10 people with dementia where we talked through different ways ChatGPT could help them write emails and help them plan out a day, right? All these different tools, right? AI and ChatGPT could be really useful for specifically in the workplace to help people continue to work if they want to and if they find that as meaningful. Other things that are really like low-hanging fruit here that we could include are any kind of voice-based interaction. So we did a survey this past spring where we were looking at we looked at mobile phone use and smartphone apps that people with dementia were using, and we found that a lot of people were using voice-based interactions, but not as their primary mode of interacting with their phone. But that doesn't mean it's not necessarily useful. It just shows that there are these emerging ways to use technology like voice-based interaction that maybe people aren't aware of that could be really, really useful, especially in a workplace context. Okay. So that was everything. I talked briefly about current use of technology. I gave you kind of hints of some of our work in the promising future directions, but I really wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, discussion, and just any thoughts. So that's all I have. Thank you all.